What up, guys? Your boy Quake, and before we get into the video, go ahead and check out my new podcast, the Diverse Mentality Podcast, where me and my co-host Sean debate hip-hop topics, talk about news in hip-hop, and even interview rappers. We deliver 2 new episodes a week, and we're available on every single streaming platform, from Spotify to Apple Music to Deezer and much more. So go ahead and check it out. The link is in the description. Of course, leave a like on this video. It helps the video out a lot. And subscribe if you haven't, and also turn on notifications when you do, so you can be notified of every single video I release. That's it. Let's get into the video.
I've always stuck to doing me, you know, and doing what works for you. Some artists can, you know, go off into different lanes with the artists that, you know, may not be as lyrical as some of the artists. And I'm one of those artists that can adapt to everything. Like I say, I'm a ghost to a lot of this in a lot of situations. You'll be surprised.
Okay.
Like I say, different artists got different things. I'm one that can adapt to any way of making the music, period. But for me, I'm not gonna come out of my element of who I am as an artist to follow no wave. I'd rather ride my own wave that I create, or I would rather, you know, if it's something that I could do that's in my own lane to add to the wave, of course.
Got you.
But I'm not gonna go jump on a wave that I know that I can't ride, or try to ride a wave that I know is not my wave.
I know what the streets want. All the DJs too.
I told you niggas I'd be back. It's Young Buck. I'm back reincarnated, bitches. Let's go.
Nigga Gucci this, Louis that. I want it all. Bentley this, Chevy that. I want it all. A house here, house there. I want it all. Put it in a plastic bag and let's ball, nigga.
What up, guys? Your boy Quake, and I'm back with a brand new episode of What Happened To. So with this episode of What Happened To, I'm going to focus on an artist, part of my favorite rap group ever, which is G-Unit. I already did a video on one of the members, Lloyd Banks, and it did amazing on views, over 1.1 million views, and the feedback was so great that I had to follow up with a different G-Unit member. And of course, as you can tell by the video title, I'm talking about Young Buck. Buck was the South piece to G-Unit. G-Unit was mainly bred in Queens, New York, but then 50 eventually expanded G-Unit and signed on Young Buck, who's part of the South, and eventually signed on The Game, who's part of the West Coast. So they covered every single territory. Young Buck was giving G-Unit and G-Unit fans that Southern flair, that crazy energy, the dope bars, the different slang, the different type of beats and sound and features, everything like that. Buck was the one that was expanding outside of just G-Unit artists, because if you remember, 50 would feature mainly G-Unit artists. Banks did the same. Yayo did the same. Buck featured a bunch of Southern artists, Ludacris, T.I., all kinds of different artists, and it was something that was needed for that group. And Buck was also the one that was consistently delivering music for the group, and eventually became the most consistent one in the group. So let's get into Young Buck's story. As you know, with this series, I talk about their upbringing, how they got into music, their peak, and what they're up to now. Young Buck was born on March 15th, 1981 as David Brown. He was originally born in Nashville, Tennessee. He grew up on a street called Sea Fried in North Nashville. Then as time would go on, him and his mother would end up moving to South Nashville, where he lived on J.C. Napier homes all the way down from the square. Then they ended up moving to the South 7 projects. Then he went to Hillwood sometimes, Overton, White Creek, all kinds of places, back and forth. Then by the time he was 8 years old, he knew Nashville from top to bottom. He would end up pumping gas for people to make quick money, mow lawns, wash cars, whatever he needed to do to make a little bit of money. And because he was all over Nashville, older people would end up just calling him Young Buck, and he ended up eventually running with that name as a rapper. And in the meantime, he would end up freestyling amongst his friends and just battling anyone that he knew in Nashville. And this is how he built a buzz for himself locally. Eventually, him and his friend ran into a CD from BG, who was signed to Cash Money at the time, called Chopper City, and on the back of the CD there was a phone number where you could call Cash Money Records. Buck and his friend Lil Jimmy had no idea what they were doing when they called. They said they wanted to book Cash Money to come to Nashville and perform, and they said the amount was around $5,000. They immediately booked it. Next thing you know, Cash Money is in Nashville looking to perform. Unfortunately, that never happened, but what did happen was Buck and Lil Jimmy ended up meeting everybody at Cash Money Records, and the first thing that Birdman told Buck was to spit a freestyle for him, and he put him up against Lil Wayne at that time, and they went back and forth. And that ended up impressing Birdman, and he ended up grabbing Young Buck from Nashville, brought him to New Orleans to hang out with them and potentially sign a record deal with Cash Money Records. Buck ended up dropping out of school at the age of 14 and was immediately focused on making his music career take off. When Buck was 14, it was 1995, and at this time, Cash Money Records wasn't a huge record label that it is now. Birdman was working with a bunch of hot boy artists to make sure they blow up. Buck ended up coming on with them and hopefully having his situation figured out as well. But as years went on, Buck said he spent 3 to 4 years with Cash Money and none of his music ever got released. He got essentially put on the back burner while the other artists on Cash Money like Lil Wayne, Juvenile, BG, so on and so forth ended up blowing up. And unfortunately, none of the music that Young Buck recorded with Cash Money was ever released. The only thing that he has to show that he was with Cash Money at that time was that he appeared in the Big Timers Big Ballin' music video. And by the time 1999 came around, Buck said he had enough of Cash Money and wanted to leave and do his own thing because nothing was working over there in terms of getting his own career going.
So I was always looking for opportunity. I seen opportunity. I took it. I was supposed to be in school at the time. I dropped out of school. I left school and went straight to New Orleans. In 2 years of my life, I hung up under Baby, kind of like back and forth. Out of those years, I mean, they progress was happening. You never even heard me on a project. Time passed and I'm watching all this success and not seeing nothing happen for me. It became a time where I was like, this shit ain't gonna work for me. So I said, fuck it, back in the streets. You know, it's 2 years gone. So you just kind of start all over.
But being with Cash Money throughout those years wasn't a loss completely. He learned a lot about the music industry. He ended up meeting DJ Paul, who was part of 3 6 Mafia at that time, who would end up playing a critical role in his career. And of course, meeting Juvenile, who was part of Cash Money at that time, would help him along the line as well. In 1999, Buck went back to Nashville and started doing his own independent thing. He got with his local friends. One of them was D-Tay. He was a rapper as well, and they released an independent album called Thuggin' Till the End on August 22nd, 2000, and this project actually ended up charting on Billboard. It was on the US R&B charts at number 34 and on the US independent charts at number 17.
Go deep and switch the sweets. I'm cocked deep in the seats, down near sleep, hand up the street, hand on my heat, twerking while I'm working the wood wheel. Whatever city I'm in, I find out where the hood is.
He managed to sell roughly $10,000 worth of music, and at that time he realized that this was the new hustle and not the street stuff that he was getting into. And even though he was getting good money, he still had one foot in the streets. And what changed that was a home invasion robbery that happened to him where he ended up getting shot multiple times. After that, he said he stopped getting involved in the streets and started focusing on the music 100%.
And out of my ordeal back in the streets, I ended up getting shot in a home invasion and a robbery. One in the arm and one in the upper thigh area. It was enough for me to wake up and really realize that, yo, if this shit keep going on like this, I'm either to get killed or I'm gonna go to jail. And I really realized that because I was getting down for real. Really started to devote more of my time to the music then, the studio, period. And
after this incident, DJ Paul heard of it and decided to reach out to Young Buck. And DJ Paul was a huge fan of Young Buck when he met him during the Cash Money days. He ended up calling Project Pat to pick up Young Buck from Nashville to bring him all the way to Memphis. They ended up recording some tracks, and one of the tracks actually made it out. This would be Young Buck's first major album placement on the track called Memphis. This was off the 3 6 Mafia album called When the Smoke Clears 66-61. Although that was a good look, he never ended up doing a deal with 3 6 Mafia and was back in Nashville hustling independently as an artist. Eventually, he started building up a great buzz to where Birdman noticed him once again and called him and said he has a group he's making called Head Busters and wants him in the group. Buck flies back out to New Orleans, meets with Birdman, and this time everything had changed. The offices were bigger, the cars were better, everything was huge because Cash Money had blown up. But after a week of just waiting around, not signing any official paperwork, Buck got frustrated once again. He ran into Juvenile there in New Orleans, and Juvenile said, I'm leaving Cash Money, come and join me, I'm going to start my own thing. And that's when officially Buck became part of Juvenile's UTP record label.
So that led to me getting a call again from Baby.
Mm-hmm.
You know, this time it was more or less, yo, I'm about to start this group called Head Busters. So, you know, at the end of the day, I went back to go try to make it happen, you know what I'm saying? I'm 20, 21 years old, then growed up. I got a local buzz now, got a few local records out, and I just went back to make that journey happen again with them, and it didn't happen. But in the process of being there, you know, things wasn't like how it was when I left. I got there, I'm like, where Manny, where Baby, where BG, you know? And I would ask Baby that. I'm like, yo, where's the other guys? And he just basically was like, you know, they're around. After being there for like a week or so of sitting around, I started to get a little itchy. Like you said, I done became a man now. It ain't like I was a child. I got things going on at home, and I came with that mind frame like, if it ain't no business here for me, I'm gonna keep it moving.
Right.
And Juvie happened to pull up at the office, and when he pulled up, he was kind of shocked to see me there. I'm like, I've been here for a whole week. And he was like, man, you wanna get up out of here for a minute? You know what I'm saying? And I took that ride with Juvie. And that's where my career started with Juvenile, because on that.
Young Buck got the contract to sign to UTP, but what he did with the contract was didn't sign it immediately. He took the contract and put it under his bed and never officially signed it, so he wasn't officially signed to Juvenile's UTP Records. During his time with UTP Records, he did release 2 projects. One of them was Born to Be a Thug on October 10th, 2002, and the other was a compilation album with the group UTP Players on October 8th, 2002. As time went on, he realized that Juvenile was having his own personal problems with his label, his former label Cash Money, and just himself in general. And at one point, Juvenile told Buck, if you run across an opportunity, go ahead and take it. Juvenile and Buck were on a tour, and they eventually stopped in New York with their tour bus. And around that time, which was 2002, 50 Cent had the hottest buzz in New York. And the bus driver for the tour bus had a connection to 50 Cent's former manager, Shaw Money XL. So Buck kept asking the driver if they could bring 50 Cent on the tour bus and potentially record some music together. Eventually, it ended up happening, but 50 was only there to record music with Juvenile. So Juvenile and 50 went to the back of the tour bus and started recording tracks together. In the meantime, Buck decided to play a couple of his own solo tracks to Lloyd Banks and Tony Yayo. A couple of tracks were played, and one of them caught the attention of Lloyd Banks. He took the track and presented it to 50 in the back of the tour bus. 50 ended up jumping on it, and this track would later be Bloodhound on the Get Rich or Die Trying album. However, this wasn't the first track ever released with Young Buck, 50 Cent, Lloyd Banks, and Tony Yayo. The first track that was ever released was a track called A Little Bit of Everything, and it was on the 50 Cent Is the Future mixtape. This was the first time they ever all collaborated together. 50 Cent liked Young Buck at that time, but he wasn't even signed to a label, so he couldn't really offer him a label deal. As time went on, Buck ended up having issues with UTP, so now he was even an independent artist looking to get a deal somewhere else. A week after the deal fizzled out with UTP, 50 Cent ended up calling Young Buck and said, hey, we want that Bloodhound track. We'll pay you $20,000 for it. Let us put it on the album. And the track is getting mixed by Eminem and Dr. Dre. 50 wanted to fly out Buck to Los Angeles to meet with him, Eminem, and Dr. Dre, and officially signed to G-Unit.
A week later, I was getting a call from Shaw Money asking me, you know, what's going on with you? And I'm like, yo, man, you know, I kind of just stepped back from the whole situation I was in, and I'm just here. He said, good, man, because, you know, that record you was playing, I was like, yeah. He's like, man, 50 want that for his album. I'm like, what? He's like, yeah, he want that for his album. I was like, you serious? He's like, yeah, man, I was playing it for M, man. M want to mix it. So I'm like, are you serious, bro? He's like, yeah, man, send me the, I need the information on the record and, payments and all that. I never sold a record in my life, didn't know nothing about business of what that would take and all of that. So I'm like, all right, man, hold on. So, from that part, and I'll tell y'all, that record was Bloodhound on 50's Get Rich or Die Trying. Basically, 50, heard the record and liked the record, seen what he seen in me, gave me the biggest opportunity of my life, and I'm here.
Buck's first major placement on G-Unit Records was on 50 Cent's Get Rich or Die Trying on the track Bloodhound. Then instead of getting his own solo album, 50 decided to drop a group G-Unit album called Beg for Mercy. And this group G-Unit album was a way to introduce Young Buck to the world before his own solo album. The group album was a huge success. It peaked at number 2 on the Billboard 200 and sold 377,000 copies within the first week, and as of now has sold over 2.7 million copies in the United States and nearly diamond worldwide. So of course, after that major success of the G-Unit debut album, Young Buck was officially introduced to the world and he was ready to drop his own solo debut album. So in 2004, he geared up to do that. But before the album came, he did what G-Unit does best, and that is release a mixtape to create buzz before the album. So on May 31st, 2004, he released his first official mixtape called Welcome to the Hood on the G-Unit platform that was hosted by DJ Who Kid. In the summer of 2004, on July 2nd, he ended up dropping the first single off his debut album called Let Me In, featuring 50 Cent. And this was a great introduction to the album. The track did very well. It peaked at number 34 on the Billboard Hot 100. Then just a month and a half later, Young Buck dropped his debut album Straight Outta Cashville on August 24th, 2004. This album debuted at number 3 and sold 361,000 copies, and it's certified platinum. And after the release of this album, they decided to push the second single called Shorty Wanna Ride on August 26th, 2004. And this would end up becoming Young Buck's highest charting solo single. It peaked at number 17 on the Billboard Hot 100. And after the major success of his debut album and going platinum, Young Buck actually broke the Nashville curse. And what that curse was that for decades, local club scenes complained about a Nashville curse that kept non-country Nashville acts from making it big, and finally someone who wasn't a country artist but an actual hip-hop artist made it huge onto the scene and went platinum. So big props to Young Buck for doing this. He broke the mold. Now there are a lot of Tennessee artists blowing up, some from Nashville, some from Memphis. You see it a lot more now due to the social media era. After the success of the album, of course, came award shows. And on November 15th, 2004 was the 2004 Vibe Awards, and something went down that would affect Young Buck's career in the long run. That night, Dr. Dre, Eminem, 50 Cent, all of G-Unit were there alongside Suge Knight. There was a guy by the name of Jimmy Johnson who put his hands on Dr. Dre, and Young Buck allegedly stabbed Jimmy Johnson, and after the stabbing was on the run. He eventually ended up turning himself in a couple days later. And it took roughly a year and a half before the case of the stabbing was officially resolved. Buck got 3 years probation and was ordered to perform 80 hours of community service. In 2005, Buck didn't drop an album, but he appeared on various people's tracks and even dropped an independent album. And on this independent album, he was promoting his upcoming artists because 50 had branched out G-Unit and gave G-Unit South to Young Buck. In 2005, Buck appeared on the 3 6 Mafia track, Stay Fly. This track was a huge success. It peaked at number 13 on the Billboard Hot 100 and went 2 times platinum. He also appeared on the Get Rich or Die Trying soundtrack, specifically on the track I'll Whoop Your Head Boy. This peaked at number 74 on the US R&B and hip hop charts. The independent album he released was called TIP, and it was released officially on October 11th, 2005. Following this, in 2006, Buck dropped a lot of mixtapes. On February 6th, 2006, he dropped a project hosted by DJ Drama called Case Dismissed, the introduction of G-Unit South, which was presenting the G-Unit South branch, all the artists that were going to come out under that branch, and the Case Dismissed part was him finally finishing the whole trial of him stabbing somebody for Dr. Dre. And this mixtape had the introduction of G-Unit South, which was supposed to be Lil Scrappy, High C, Day T, Young Buck, and BG. That was supposed to be the intro of G-Unit South, and Lil Scrappy had a track on here called Money in the Bank, which ended up blowing up that year as well. That track peaked at number 7 on the Billboard Hot 100, which was a good look for G-Unit South. Following this, Buck dropped 2 more mixtapes, one on August 4th, 2006 called Chronic 2006, hosted by Jamie Foxx and DJ Who Kid. Then just a couple weeks later, he dropped another mixtape called Welcome to the Trap House, hosted by DJ Drama. And this mixtape was used to promote his upcoming album called Buck the World, which would be released in 2007. The first single off the album was called I Know You Want Me, featuring Jazzy Faye. And this track was released in November of 2006 and peaked at number 67 on the US Hot R&B and Hip Hop songs. And this, in my opinion, is one of the best Young Buck tracks ever made. It's very smooth. Buck flows over it perfectly, and it's just the production, everything from the video production is just perfect. I'm surprised this didn't chart a lot higher. Now, around this time, there were a lot of behind-the-scenes things happening with G-Unit Records as a label. 50 Cent and his former manager, Sha Money XL, who was managing everyone on the label at that time, weren't seeing eye to eye when it comes to business. So 50 told everyone to get new management, and that's what everyone had to do. According to Young Buck, he was really close with Sha Money XL and didn't want to leave him high and dry, so he wanted to stay on Sha Money's side of everything. And 50 initially had a problem with that. But 50 Cent says his issues with Young Buck came about from Young Buck being cool with all of 50's enemies at that time, such as The Game, Jadakiss, Fat Joe, Jim Jones, and much more. On top of that, 50 says Young Buck kept blowing way too much money and wouldn't take care of his taxes, and that 50 had to pay his taxes twice, and then the third time it happened, that's when he really had issues with Buck. And around this time, you would see Buck performing by himself, not around any G-Unit members. So in interviews, people would always ask him, are you still part of G-Unit? Buck would say yes, but we're just doing our own thing right now, trying to grow our own brand.
I'm G-Unit to the bone.
Okay, I was about to say, so G-Unit, Buck is G-Unit all
straight
day.
Up and down.
Ain't gonna know
God
it.
forbid, but the minute that you ever see me away from this is death or the penitentiary. I don't believe in breaking up or leaving away from something that I helped create, my dude. So, yeah, it's G-Unit to the bone, girl. So you see that? It's G-Unit South at the end of the day. You heard?
But behind the scenes, according to Buck, him and 50 hadn't talked for nearly 8 months while he was on this promo run for his new album. And Buck says it was Sha Money XL that told Buck to call 50 and hash things out. They had the conversation and worked things out. And then that's when they started focusing on Buck's album and started pushing the second single, Get Buck. It was released officially on February 13th, 2007 and peaked at 87 on the Billboard Hot 100. Then just a month later, Buck officially drops his second album, Buck the World, on March 27th, 2007. The album debuted at number 3 on the Billboard 200 and sold 140,000 copies in its first week, and as of now has gone gold. After the release of the album, they decided to push one more single called You Ain't Going Nowhere, and they pushed it to radio stations on May 18th, 2007, and this track peaked at number 57 on the US Hot R&B and Hip Hop songs. Buck kept the music coming and dropped 2 more projects in 2007. The second one was They Don't Bother Me, which was an independent album released on May 1st, 2007. Then a couple months later, Buck dropped a new mixtape called Mr. Tennessee, Product of the South, on September 4th, 2007. It was around this time that Buck started promoting himself more as a solo artist. He would push Cashville Records instead of G-Unit South. He would wear t-shirts that says Tennessee instead of G-Unit clothing. And this would prompt people to ask him, is he still in G-Unit? Does he still rock with 50, Banks, and Yayo? He would always say yes, but there was still tension behind the scenes.
Bless y'all, Cashville Records is my label.
I'm not leaving G-Unit. Me and 50 is good. Focus what we are doing. It's a movement.
This is 50.com. Y'all go check that out.
We get to the money, man. Cashville Records, Young Buck. The outlaw.
What made things worse was in January of 2008, Young Buck came out to a show with Lil Wayne and Birdman. Birdman and Lil Wayne said that he needs to come over to Young Money Cash Money and leave the bullshit label that he's with. And Buck seemed to be agreeing with that while he was out at the show. 50, of course, saw this and didn't like this one bit, and this is where the problems started to happen once again. Buck kept distancing himself from G-Unit and working with people that 50 had problems with.
Hold up, dude. We gotta let him know. Hold up. We gotta let him know. We're in Memphis. We're to the key. We're to the key. And we ain't gonna represent without Buck. And we ain't represent the go. We ain't represent that wrong. You understand me? I told the Buck today from Buck trying to fuck with him. That's what it is. I'm trying to fuck with him. Believe it. And then pull him from out that other bullshit. Believe that. Put him where he's supposed to be. That's what it is. That's how it's supposed to be.
Hold on, Wayne. Fuck that. Where he started at.
Where he started at. So like I said, Young Money, Cash Money, Young Buck, we doing it how we won't fucking do it. Make some noise.
And then on top of that, the following month in February of 2008, G-Unit dropped a new mixtape gearing up for their new album called Return of the Body Snatchers Volume 1. However, Young Buck was nowhere to be found on this mixtape, and this was confusing to fans because a couple months prior, they released a track called Feel Good, which featured all four of them on one track. So now fans were questioning what is really going on behind the scenes with G-Unit and Young Buck. Then in March of 2008, 50 Cent and Young Buck had a conversation that nobody knew about, but Young Buck didn't know at that time that 50 Cent was recording the conversation. Ultimately, after this conversation, 50 and Buck were cool again. There was another G-Unit mixtape dropped that month called Elephant in the Sand, and this time, Young Buck was featured on various tracks. However, this reunion would be short-lived. Just a couple weeks later, on March 20th, 2008, an interview with Yo Rap's magazine came out where Young Buck said he received no royalties from 50 Cent or G-Unit Records. In the quote, he said, "I'm still waiting on a royalty check, period. I've never seen a royalty check since I've signed with G-Unit, so hell yeah, I'll tell you one damn thing, that show money is that good. I've never in my career cashed a royalty check. How you like that?" Well, this interview caused more problems for Young Buck and 50 Cent. Unfortunately, this interview was old, and the outlet released it a couple months after, so Shaw Money XL the following day on March 21st, 2008, commented on the article and denied everything. He said, "There has been a new rumor going on that 50 Cent has not paid Young Buck any royalties. I, as Buck's manager and former president of G-Unit Records, want to make that clear that the rumor is false. Young Buck has cleared over $10 million from working under 50s and my guidance. I don't know if the writer waited 2 months from the interview to stir some new drama up or took his words wrong, but Buck is waving the G-Unit flag strong. I also add that any talks of Buck signing to any other labels are false. People are playing on the divide and conquer card, and that's not going to work." However, this didn't solve the issues between 50 and Buck, because a couple weeks later, on April 7th, 2008, on a Monday morning, 50 Cent called in to Hot 97 and officially announced that Young Buck is no longer part of G-Unit as a group, but he's still signed to G-Unit Records as a solo artist. The following week, the whole group of G-Unit went to Hot 97, and 50 revealed in further detail why Young Buck isn't part of the group anymore, and he said Buck has a drug problem. Buck remained quiet throughout this whole situation until a couple weeks later, and on May 12th, 2008, he dropped a new track called My Interview, where he addresses himself being kicked out of G-Unit and the drug situation. Following this, things were quiet between Young Buck and G-Unit, but on June 15th, 2008, Young Buck went on stage and yelled out, "Fuck G-Unit."
Fuck G-Unit, nigga. Hey, you know. When I made the statement, I ain't never seen a royalty check. I didn't say that shit saying that the nigga 50 done took money from me or none of that old shit or the nigga owe me or no shit. I said it because it's real, nigga. You understand?
Just a couple days later, on June 17, 2008, 50 Cent officially drops the full taped conversation where Buck is crying to him on the phone. Following this, just a day later, Young Buck drops an official diss track towards 50 Cent on June 18, 2008, called The Taped Conversation, which was his response to that taped phone call.
Record my phone call when I spoke from the heart. That was a year ago. This was a joke from the start. You a hoe.
Then a couple days later, The Game jumps on the official remix on June 21st, 2008, and there was announced a Game and Young Buck mixtape scheduled to come in July called Worth More Than 50 Cents, but that never ended up happening. Then on July 1st, 2008, G-Unit dropped their second album, Terminate on Sight, and Young Buck was only featured on 4 tracks on the album. Following this, for the rest of 2008, Young Buck didn't really release any new music. According to Buck, 50 Cent was hindering the process of him recording a new album and releasing it. So in 2009, what he had to do was take a different route and start releasing mixtapes. And for me in 2009, this is when I really loved Young Buck's music because he was really hungry. You could tell in the music he was in a bad situation, and you could hear it in his voice when he was rapping. So a lot of the music that came out in 2009, to me personally, is my favorite from him. The first mixtape he released that year was on April 11th, called Back for the Streets, hosted by The Future. Then, just a month later, he would drop a mixtape that would increase his buzz and become a staple for that year. On May 26, 2009, he dropped Back on My Buck Shit, hosted by DJ Smalls and DJ Scream. And there were some loose tracks that Young Buck released around this time that I really love. Some of them are I Want It All, which is a dope track. I Got It, featuring Young Jeezy. That track is amazing as well. Buck kept the mixtapes going since he couldn't release an album, and on September 16th, 2009, he dropped a new mixtape called Only God Can Judge Me, hosted by The Real Rick Ross, Freeway Ricky Ross. Following this, Young Buck would slow down on the release of music for a little while because he would start facing some personal legal problems. On August 3rd, 2010, the IRS raided Young Buck's home for over $300,000 in unpaid taxes. And while they raided his home, they found a gun. And since he was a convicted felon due to the incident that happened at the 2004 Vibe Awards, this was an issue, and they ended up charging him for that gun despite Young Buck pleading that it wasn't his. Just 3 days later, Young Buck dropped a new track on August 6, 2010 called My Campaign, where he addresses the IRS raid. And to me, this is one of my favorite Young Buck tracks of all time because he takes these tragic moments in his life and instantly goes to the music and expresses how he feels, which is rare for a lot of artists, and I really like that about Buck.
Exactly what happened. They found this 40 Glock in my home during the IRS raid from taking things out of my home. When they first found the gun, I looked and they was like, well, whose is this? And I said, that's my tour manager's gun, which it was. He's licensed to carry, you know. I guess he had left it in one of the rooms or whatnot. And it was nothing to them. They kept the gun and took it with them. 8 months later, I get indicted from the federal government on felon in possession of a firearm. And they found one bullet in my home as well that didn't match none of the guns or none of that, not even the gun that they found. But they charged me with felon in possession of ammunition.
A couple weeks after the IRS raid, on August 19th, 2010, Young Buck files for Chapter 13 bankruptcy. And through this bankruptcy, it allowed him to be released from the G-Unit Records contract. So a couple weeks after that, Young Buck dropped his new independent album, The Rehab, on September 7th, 2010. The album debuted at number 55 on the Billboard 200 and sold over 6,400 copies in its first week. Following that, Buck continued the music and dropped the second installment to his Back on My Buck Shit series, Volume 2, Change of Plans, on October 31st, 2010. And one of my favorite tracks off this project is called I'm Taxin'. Check it out. Following this, in 2011, Young Buck didn't drop a new mixtape, but was promoting his Back on My Buck Shit Volume 2 mixtape by shooting a bunch of music videos. On top of that, in 2011, he was facing a lot more legal problems. In March of 2011, G-Unit Records filed a $10 million lawsuit against Young Buck. So he had a lot on his plate in 2011 in terms of legal trouble. However, there was hope that Young Buck would eventually get back into G-Unit, because in late 2011, 50 Cent ended up tweeting at Young Buck saying, "For some reason, I think Young Buck is mad at me. Who cares? Give me my $250,000 back, sucker." And this would be the first interaction 50 and Buck had in years. But towards the end of 2011, he was dropping quite a few singles to promote his next mixtape, which would be released on January 24th, 2012, called Live Loyal, Die Rich. A couple months later, on March 4th, 2012, Young Buck would survive a drive-by shooting. That night, apparently, he got into a scuffle at a club in South Nashville. Him and his girl were chilling in the car. They came through, drove past the car, and hit it 11 times. Thankfully, Young Buck wasn't hurt, but his girlfriend was hit once on the shoulder. Following this, Buck had to face trial for what he owed to the IRS. So on July 13th, 2012, Young Buck was officially sentenced to 18 months in prison on weapons charges. The IRS that following month held an auction to sell off Young Buck's material. They ended up collecting $53,000 back in all of that.
The IRS says this auction was the last resort as it tries to get the nearly $200,000 in taxes the former G-Unit star owes.
We will sell this merchandise for as much as we can, and a lot of that will be applied toward the tax debt.
Perhaps the hottest items today, the rapper's signature cash-filled diamond necklace. This man bought it for $12,000.
It makes money. It's scratched for $13,500 in gold.
And the most heated bidding war was over a hard drive.
Yeah. Yes! Now 16. Yes!
Everyone thought it might contain the platinum-selling star's unreleased music. Turns out this guy who bought it for $3,000, well, he didn't realize the IRS had already wiped it clean.
It's worthless. It's about worth $100 now.
Yeah, it's worthless.
What were you going to do if the music was on there?
Make a bankroll, man.
On August 6, 2012, Young Buck officially turns himself in to serve his 18 months in prison. Young Buck, however, recorded a lot of music, and on October 31st, 2012, a new mixtape called Strictly for Traps and Trunks 44 Free Young Buck Edition was released for the fans. Then a year and a half went by, and on October 2nd, 2013, Young Buck was officially released from prison. After his release, no new music came out, so a lot of dead time was passing. But what we didn't know as fans behind the scenes was that 50 Cent was mending the relationships between Tony Yayo, Lloyd Banks, and even Young Buck. Then on June 1st, 2014, for Hot 97's Summer Jam, 50 Cent brings out all three artists, and everyone goes crazy, and officially there is a G-Unit reunion. Following that, they started flooding the streets with a bunch of freestyles over other artists' beats, which is the classic G-Unit approach. Then they announced that they're releasing 2 new EPs. The first EP, called The Beauty of Independence, was released on August 25th, 2014. It debuted at number 17 on the Billboard 200 with first week sales of 14,472 copies. Following this, Buck dropped a mixtape before the second G-Unit EP came out. This mixtape was called Before the Beast. It was released on February 12th, 2015. Then the second G-Unit EP drops on March 3rd, 2015, called The Beast is G-Unit. This EP debuted at number 27 on the Billboard 200 and sold 18,500 copies in its first week. And to be fair, a lot of these tracks on these EPs are fire. Ballin' is one of my favorites. Bring My Bottle, which is one of Buck's records, that's one of my favorites. Changes on The Beauty is one of my favorites. G-Unit just had it spot on with the music here. Following this, Young Buck decided to start a 10 series of 10 mixtapes, where it would be 10 something. So the first one would be on April 7th, 2015, called 10 Bullets, hosted by DJ Who Kid. Following that, in May of 2015, he dropped another mixtape called 10 Bricks. Then on December 10th of 2015, another one called 10 Pints. Then in 2016, he would release more music but would find himself in some more legal trouble. On July 15, 2016, he dropped another mixtape called 10 Bodies, hosted by DJ Drama and DJ Who Kid. But following that, just a week later, he would end up getting arrested for threatening to burn down his ex-girlfriend's apartment. Then on August 10, 2016, he got sentenced to 7 months in prison for that. Following that, more new music would come out from G-Unit. On August 30th, 2016. The Lost Flash Drive G-Unit mixtape was released. These are throwaways that never made it out officially, and man, they're full of fire tracks. I really wish that G-Unit album would have been finished because some of these tracks on here just shows how great that album could have been. Following this, Buck kept releasing mixtapes. On June 30th, 2017, he dropped 10 Toes Down, and on December 1st, 2017, he dropped 10 Street Commandments. Then in 2018, it would seem like Young Buck was gearing up to drop his third studio album. The first single he released from that album was on March 30th, 2018, called Can't Lose, and this track by far is amazing. I'm very disappointed in the performance of this track. It should have blown up. Everyone should have caught on to it. Buck was on the right track with this as the first single. Then a couple months later, Young Buck announced that his third studio album would be executive produced by 50 Cent and Dr. Dre.
Shout out to Battle Cat. He got a real strong relationship with Dre. My vision is to have 50 and Dre, get behind the next executive produce my next project. And, I just haven't had that conversation. He immediately got Dre on the phone. So, shout out to Dre.
You talked to Dre?
Yeah.
What y'all say? What did he say?
It was a quick conversation, honestly, man. He he really thought that I was around at the time in LA. I was in Seattle.
Yeah.
So he was like, pull up, man. Immediately, Buck, man, what? Pull up. And I'm like, nah, I'm up here in Seattle. And I kind of really quick gave him my whole outlook. Was like, look, Dre, bro, I'm heating up out here. The streets been waiting on this. At the end of the day, I want to see if it's a possibility of you even getting involved with my project. And he was like, yo, man, I'm open to it. I ain't seen you in a while, so I want to see you. You know what I'm saying? And we'll go from there. And yesterday, I was sitting with 50. Yo, 50, what up, bro? You know what I'm saying? I got the juice, feel for real, like, and at this point, is it? Am I wrong for asking for Dre to come in and executive, produce this project and even have a conversation with him and see if he want to slide in and get a piece of it?
Get them all.
Get them all. Yeah. So it's like 50 immediately looked at me like, "What? Of course." I'm all the way open to it. Yeah, I'm doing it. Yeah, I'm with it. What anything that's, benefiting you and any other guys, I'm never gonna stand in front of or try to hold back. I got his blessing, so it's just.
So while pushing that first single, he's decided to flood the streets with more mixtapes, and on July 3rd, 2018, he dropped 10 Plugs. Then on October 12th, 2018, he dropped 10 Politics, and just a couple weeks later, on October 31st, 2018, he dropped 10 Felonies. Then around this time, things between 50 Cent and Young Buck would turn for the worse once again. On 50 Cent's side of the story, he feels Young Buck owes him over $300,000, and he would cease and desist anything that Young Buck released via G-Unit Records. 50 would also clown Buck on him getting caught up with a trans person, but Buck's side of the story is that trans situation didn't go down the way everyone thinks, and that's not the reason why 50 was going at him. The reason why 50 went at him was because Buck found out that more money was owed to him than what he thought and addressed 50 Cent on the situation.
The checks were being sent to G-Unit Incorporated or whatnot, which is 50 Cent's company. So of course, I got those 3 years of checks right then and there. But then the question started to come about is, where's all the other money? Where did that go? So instead of me, coming at a negative approach or whatnot, they were the ones that stressed out to 50 and let him know that going forward, they were going to send me my own checks. From that moment, 50 blocked me from Instagram. I'm sure his phone numbers as well. And everything that the world sees now started to play out.
Buck, however, kept releasing music, and on February 14, 2019, he dropped an EP called Box of Chocolates. Then on April 12, 2019, he dropped a new mixtape called Compulsive. Then on November 1st, 2019, he dropped the Impeachment soundtrack. Then in 2020, Young Buck would do something that he did initially when he had problems with 50 Cent and the whole cease and desist issue with G-Unit Records. He ended up filing for bankruptcy again so he can get out of his G-Unit contract. Now that he's out, he kept releasing music and dropped an Outbreak EP on May 20th, 2020. Then in 2021, he would flood the streets with 2 more mixtapes, which was Vaccine on February 19th, 2021. Then just a week later, dropped the Back on My Buck Shit Volume 3 on February 26th, 2021. And the Back on My Buck Shit mixtape, the Volume 3, is really good. One of my favorite tracks is Ridiculous. I'm very disappointed in how short it is, but man, it's fire. Buck also has an upcoming project with 3 6 Mafia's DJ Paul, and I'm really excited to hear that because I know when they get together, they tend to make very good music. Buck consistently delivers on music, and it's a damn shame as a genuine G-Unit fan, we never got to see them get back together at their full potential because we never got a full G-Unit album ever. Tony Yayo was locked up when the first one came out, and when the second one came out, Buck was on his way out. So we never got that ever as an experience. I'm very disappointed in the fact that how a lot of these things turned out with G-Unit. As a genuine fan, Banks and 50 not talking, Buck and 50 having issues, and I was really excited to hear that Buck album executive produced by Dr. Dre and 50. I feel like that would have been something that would have put G-Unit back on the map, and I just wish 50 would have handled the situation better, and I wish he would focus more on the music end because us as fans never got the great G-Unit experience. And hats off to Young Buck because he feels for the G-Unit fans. He's definitely tried to make the situation better and tried to help everything come back together. He was the one that was kept pushing for music, him and Who Kid a lot of the time, and I really appreciate both of them for doing that because us as fans really want just music. That's all we care about. We don't care about this drama back and forth. It's a damn shame, like I said, we never got a full G-Unit album. But that's enough of me ranting on. Go ahead and check out those Young Buck tracks I recommended. Tracks like I Want It All, I'm Taxin', I Got It with Jeezy, My Campaign, which is another record that I really, really love, Ridiculous, which is off this Back on My Buck Shit Volume 3. Those are some of my favorite Buck tracks of all time. I Know You Want Me off Buck the World, so on and so forth. That's it for this video. I hope you guys enjoyed this episode of What Happened To. And one day, hopefully I can get all of G-Unit together on my podcast and they can talk about everything. That's one of my goals in my career, period, is to have all of G-Unit together. Hopefully that happens one day because, like I said, us as fans, we just care about the music. We don't care about the stupid things back and forth. Those things can be resolved. They're all grown men. Hopefully that happens one day once again. That's it for today's video. If you guys want to support this channel further, you can do so at patreon.com/diverse mentality. For just $1 a month or more, you can help support this channel further. A link is in the description below. Like, comment, share, and definitely subscribe. I do videos like this daily on hip-hop news and much more, so definitely subscribe. Follow me on Twitter and on Instagram at QuakeGW. Like us on Facebook, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Peace.